This is the face of a very great composer who was born just exactly 100 years ago. Rachmaninoff, Sergei Vasilyevich Rachmaninoff. It's a very Russian face, beautiful face, very melancholy, very Russian. And although it would be difficult to look sadder than this, it would also be difficult to be more popular. Sad? Yes. Fatalistic? Certainly. But that can't be all his music has to offer. It has to have a lot more qualities to remain as popular as Rachmaninoff. I mean, there's been a lot of music that's been wildly popular, but then it kind of disappears, whereas Rachmaninoff's just refuses to go away. It's guaranteed to fill any concert hall, any time, any place, and all over the globe, concert promoters bow in homage every night and thank God for Rachmaninoff, especially for that second concerto. So what is that secret ingredient in the music? Well, we'd have to oversimplify it very quickly, and that is, I suppose, that it has enormous directness of expression and complete, total honesty, qualities which, as we will see in a minute, strangely enough worked against him. Prelude in C-sharp minor, the prelude. At times in his career, it seemed he'd never composed another note.
Rachmaninoff had graduated from the Moscow Conservatoire at 18 with its highest honor, the gold medal. He wrote, "Tchaikovsky, one of the examiners, predicted a great future for me, but within a year I was broke. So I wrote this prelude and sold it outright to a publisher for a few rubles."
The piece became a millstone around Rachmaninoff's neck. It swept the world, not only as a popular classic, but also in dozens of insane, jazzed-up versions.
Even if in its original version it haunted Rachmaninoff all his life, wherever I went, I was expected to play it as an encore at every single concert. Ironically, since I had sold the copyright, I gained nothing from it except notoriety. It haunted me everywhere. I had to play it for friends and casual acquaintance who cornered me in the hotel lobbies. I had to play it for influential concert managers, and he had to play it for rich ladies with blue hair whose husbands owned the freehold of the local concert halls. But don't let's waste time on it, otherwise we'll be committing the same sin that has been perpetrated for years, that of concentrating on the war horses of Rachmaninoff at the expense of the better and greater works. The C-sharp minor prelude is one of the early pieces. Now here is a much better work. The Etude Tableau in E flat minor, played by Vladimir Ashkenazy. Rachmaninoff composed that piece in February 1917 in a Russia torn by strife. February was a month of demonstrations from people desperate for bread. It developed into a general strike. In Petrograd on February the 26th, the strike toppled the Tsar and his government. In Moscow that afternoon, Rachmaninoff was giving a piano recital. It was to be my last recital in my liberated country. When he received his fee, he sent it to be spent for the benefit of released political prisoners and to help the sick and the wounded. Everything around me, the political situation, the sadness, the brutality of everyday life, affects me so that I cannot work. Everyone advises me to leave Russia, but everything I have is here. In purely practical terms, I should be penniless, for I have sunk my entire earnings into Ivanovka. That was the name of his estate in the country. There he would relax with his wife and their two little girls, Irina and Tatiana, a place he adored, where he was happy, where he could compose. Proudly he sits at the wheel of his first automobile, a magnificent drophead, to have his picture taken by Natalia, his wife. He liked to play farmer, planting willow trees, saplings, hundreds of them. He even placed an order for one of those newfangled tractors to be shipped from America. Because of the revolution, it never arrived. At the end of the summer, we returned to Moscow, Rachmaninoff said, but on October the 25th, the shots and machine guns in the streets signified another change of government. There was no time to lose. I had to get my wife and children out of Russia, but how? All musical activity was suspended until the return to normal conditions. Now, Rachmaninoff's career, remember, took three different directions: composer, conductor, and pianist. Now, all three of them were blocked. Then, by God's good grace, I received a telegram from Sweden inviting me to give some concerts in Stockholm. We managed somehow to get visas, and since I had no ready cash, we borrowed a handful of rubles from friends. We threw a few possessions into a suitcase, but all that was dear to me had to be left behind: my manuscripts, my home, and my country. It was one evening at the beginning of the year. We got on a tramcar that jerked us through the unlit streets of Moscow to the railway station. Through the dusk and the drizzle, we could hear scattered shots. There was no one to see us off, though Shaliapin sent us a note attached to some caviar and some homemade bread for the journey, a kindness which nearly broke my heart. At the frontier, the customs officer searched what little luggage we had, but thank God he was only interested in the children's school books. He bade us a polite farewell and said he hoped the concerts would be successful. When I asked about Swedish currency, he pointed to my two hands and said, "These are your exchange rate." For much of the journey, we traveled in an open sledge. It was cold, December the 23rd, just a few days before Christmas, when we left Russia forever. The breath of exiles is the thought of home. Exile, separation from the homeland, life lived out among strangers, pitiful attempts to keep hold of some reminder of the past, a photograph, a book, a bundle of letters, the fading memory of faces long since dead, or the recollection of a tune that comes quite suddenly, flooding into the mind, recalling with a resentful tenderness all that has been lost. It is by such things that the exile stays alive, for the breath of exiles is the thought of home.
That music we just played was only the first half of the slow movement of Rachmaninoff's wonderful Second Symphony. I must say that we'd like nothing better than to play you the entire symphony without a single cut in it, but then there'd be room for nothing else because to play it through once takes just a little over 1 hour. At any rate, at the age of 45, Rachmaninoff was suddenly uprooted. And all of a sudden, he had to concentrate the major part of his career on being a concert pianist. Now, therefore, he had to enlarge his repertoire in order to encompass that phenomenal amount of music which every concert pianist must have at his fingertips if he's to survive. Now, this is difficult enough for a young man at the beginning of his career, but for a 45-year-old emigre, it must have seemed like an insurmountable task. But he achieved it. He achieved it and a lot more, because he became, you could say, the greatest pianist of his age. And this, in America and in Europe, was how he spent the remaining years of his life, captivating audiences time and time again. But he never assumed the grand manner. He never insisted on the retinue and the luxuries and the airs and graces required by, well, say, Paderewski. On the contrary, his life now assumed that very, very unglamorous side of the traveling virtuoso that the public never sees. Faceless hotels and drafty railway stations and endless journeys and another concert and another train and another journey and another concert, and he hated it. He hated it because it interfered with his composing. The adulation he received as a performer was foreign to his nature. He was a quiet man, contemplative, deeply sensitive, but still the audiences had to be satisfied.
The older we get, the more we lose that divine self-confidence which is the treasure of youth. Fewer are those moments when we believe that what we have done is good. We get lucrative contracts, more in fact than we can accept, but we're still longing for that inner satisfaction which is independent of outside success. Nowadays, it very rarely happens to me to feel sincerely satisfied with myself, to feel that what I do is really a success. And those rare occasions stick in my memory for a long time. I recollect the city where I felt the thrill of satisfaction last, and I remember all the details. I remember the concert hall where everything seemed to be perfect that night, the lighting, the piano, the audience. Only on such occasions do I feel really happy.
Luckily, there are piano rolls and quite a lot of discs which give some indication of his skill, of the amazing technical skill and the beauties and subtleties of his playing, and amazingly enough of the humor too, especially in the fiendishly difficult transcriptions he made of other people's music. I remember very well, I couldn't have been more than maybe 9 years old, but in the United States I did have the good fortune of seeing him play 3 times. Of course, from my child's point of view, I was totally unaware that I was watching a page of musical history. I remember very well what he played, down to the last encore, but my prime recollection was that from a 9-year-old's point of view, I saw this immensely imposing figure. He was very, very tall and very gaunt and severe looking. He came out of the wings, and I thought, well, he'll never make it to the piano. I mean, he walked so slowly and with such fragile care. And he got to the middle of the piano, and he sat down, and by that time I was sorry for him. And then suddenly, the most extraordinary transformation, because within a split second, as soon as he played the first note, there was a kind of power and majesty that came not only from the piano, but that emanated from him and filled the hall and riveted your attention to him. I've never forgotten it. His platform manner was very severe. There was none of that fashionable swooning and swaying about. It was all right in the fingers. During one of the rehearsal breaks in this show, I talked to my good friend Ashkenazy about Rachmaninoff. You know, it's funny, because I was looking at this, which is Grove's Dictionary, which is kind of the standard reference book, and a very, very fine book at that. It comes in, 280 volumes or something. And I looked up Rachmaninoff, and here, let me read you something.
Yes,
it
please.
says, technically, he was highly gifted, but also severely limited. His music is well constructed and ineffective, but monotonous in texture, which consists in essence mainly of artificial and gushing tunes, accompanied by a variety of figures derived from arpeggios. Now, if you're not sick yet, let me go on. The enormous popular success some few of Rachmaninoff's works had in his lifetime is not likely to last, and musicians never regarded him with much favor.
Well, when is it due for revision, I'd like to know.
This year. This year.
God.
This year, yes, that is a good question.
Well, it seems to me that those who run down Rachmaninoff never take enough trouble to try and really understand his music and understand its spiritual background. To learn more about the Russian character, the Russian soul, all the kinds of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Pushkin and everything. And you must remember that Russia, although it is, of course, it has always been a part of Europe, it took very much from Europe, it imitated many European things. It developed in a different way.
It developed which way differently?
Spiritually, it developed in a different way. You must remember that in Russia they say sometimes that unless you feel very much, you don't feel at all.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a motto in England, or for that matter in a few Western countries, would be a reverse of this. It would be probably, you can feel very much but don't show it,
Yes.
Right. Well, therefore, those who often say that Rachmaninoff's music is vulgar, they miss a point, that it could never be considered vulgar in Russia. And now, if you consider Rachmaninoff vulgar, you've got to consider the whole of Russian culture vulgar. Now, you can't go as far as that. And there is no doubt in my mind, or in many Russian people's mind, Russian persons' minds, that Rachmaninoff is a pure expression of the Russian soul.
Talk to me a little bit about the third concerto. I mean, for instance, at the last Leeds piano competition, when all the pianists, all the competitors got through with that which was prescribed, and they could choose, all these young people, with the exception of one, I think, chose Rachmaninoff third concerto. Now, why?
Well, it's one of his best pieces. Pianistically, it is one of the most difficult in the world. So for a young pianist, it's always a great challenge to try to tackle this concerto.
Yes, I think it's in terms of just playing all the notes, I mean, let's get down to that kind of silly argument.
Just that, yeah.
Just, yes, if you're really just going to play all the notes of a piece, I cannot think of a concerto that's technically more difficult.
Can I?
You can't?
No.
Well, one last thing about the concerto, and that is that, everybody, including we on this program, have made a lot of his fatalism and the sadness in his music and all that, and yet I think that the third concerto, despite the fact that it has a tragic theme, is, when it's all over, the most optimistic piece he ever wrote. Do you
Yes,
agree
I
with
think so too, yes. Of course, in all his optimism, there is always another layer. I mean, it isn't a direct optimism, to the bottom. I mean, it has layers of sadness.
Oh, yes.
Sadness and hope, sadness and hope. It's all the time like that.
Well, otherwise he'd be Offenbach.
Yeah.
No, I just mean, but the climactic movement, I mean, the third movement, is certainly an expression of faith rather than of absolute despair. third movement of the third piano concerto by Rachmaninoff. You know, that kind of piano writing and that kind of brilliance, those big, beautiful string tunes, that's all been pinched and used and misused in countless film scores. Oh, sometimes they use the real thing. I remember they used the second piano concerto in a lovely film called Brief Encounter, but mainly it's what you could call fake Rachmaninoff. You know the ones I mean, the kind of Warsaw Concerto and Spellbound and like that. But actually the difference between the cinema imitation Rachmaninoff and the genuine Rachmaninoff is just insurmountable, because the genuine Rachmaninoff has that honest, heartfelt lyricism. I suppose you could say in a way that Rachmaninoff was born 30 years too late, because he had all that beautiful romanticism in that severe, gaunt, misleading frame of his. In its essentials, his musical style changed very little all through his life. The sweeping melodies, those opulent harmonies, and the sadness, always that sadness. It was always there right from the beginning, right from the very first piece. In a moment, we'll play for you the waltz from his symphonic dances, a work he composed right at the very end of his life. And you'll see that those warm, romantic qualities stayed with him right up to the end. Because all his life, no matter what Stravinsky, Bartok, Schoenberg, Hindemith, what all those boys were up to, Rachmaninoff went on totally impervious to what the avant-garde of the moment was up to. Even in his private life, he was strangely impervious to outside events, and that's unusual, because in the case of most composers, you can see, well, to some extent, the outside world mirrored in their music, but not Rachmaninoff, except for that one single, overriding, cataclysmic event in his life.
I had to leave the land where I was born, where I grew up, where I struggled and suffered all the sorrows of the young, and where finally I achieved success. The whole world is open to me, and success awaits me everywhere. Only one place is closed to me, and that is my own country, Russia.
That was the waltz from his last work, the Symphonic Dances, one of the handful of pieces, including the Third Symphony and the Paganini Rhapsody, which he wrote in America during the last years of his life. This was after a long, sterile gap of many years where he composed virtually nothing in his adopted land. Looking back on his threefold career as pianist and composer and conductor, he was very fond of quoting a favorite proverb of his. He would say, "I have hunted 3 hares throughout my life. Can I be sure I caught one of them?" Do you remember earlier on in the program we referred to the musical reference book, Grove's Music Dictionary? And what did they say about Rachmaninoff? They said something about the fact that his music was artificial and the popularity wasn't likely to last with anybody. Well, I think musicians and audiences alike hold a rather different view today, because both as a man and as a composer, Rachmaninoff possessed complete integrity. You must never forget that he never sought to be popular. That immense lyrical gift, all those beautiful melodies and harmonies, they were never grafted on cynically to seek favor. They were simply an expression of his musical personality, which in turn was his very own personality. Rachmaninoff, unlike all those who imitated him, never was reduced to forging his own signature.
At the end of his life, winter 1943, when he was very ill, he always kept a radio by his bed, says his daughter, Irina. He would listen anxiously to the news from the Russian front. He was worried, too, about Tatiana, his other daughter, who was still in France. His health had been poor for some time. At first, he was told pleurisy, but then the doctors diagnosed cancer. At times, he asked his nurse, a Russian, no other would do, where the music he could hear was coming from. Then he realized it was only in his imagination. He died a few days before his 70th birthday. A man who gave and still gives pleasure to millions. A man who could speak to people in a language which they could understand. A man whom only few were allowed to know well. A man out of place in a brawling world. A man who kept alive in his heart and in his music a romance which the world threatens to destroy.